We picture Vikings with axes raised and shields locked. But the bloodshed wasn't the end. When the noise of steel faded, their agony was over. It was the wives, the daughters, every woman left breathing who entered a nightmare worse than death. The sagas whisper of it, then fall silent. Because what came after the battle wasn't just cruelty, it was calculated horror. The monastery at Kinmachno collapsed under Thorgil's fleet. 43 monks slaughtered at the altar. The record stopped cold when it comes to the women. But the ground still speaks, iron shackles sized for wrists, ankle rings for children, and warehouses designed for flesh, not grain. Dublin's Norsemen didn't just steal gold. They stole people. A wife became merchandise. The price? 20 silver for youth, 15 for a mother, 10 if she was broken. Receipts carved into stone. But sometimes being sold was the best fate. In 862, Portmaro burned. 47 warriors dead. 53 women dragged screaming into longhouses. The annals stay silent but the bogs tell the story. 23 female bodies, each bearing deliberate wounds. Skulls smashed from behind. Arms shattered as they tried to shield themselves. Ribs broken from repeated blows. This was not chaos. This was ritual execution, planned and carried out days later. And it would not be the last. The great heathen army crushed King Ethelred's men. But what about the royal women? The annals don't dare say. The stones do. Iron oxide stains, blood residue baked into palace floors, enough for dozens of lives extinguished. When the Viking ships left the shores of raided lands, they carried more than treasure. They carried people in chains. The wives and daughters of the fallen were crammed into the hulls, bound and terrified, not knowing where they were being taken. For them, the nightmare was only moving to its next chapter. The Vikings had built a thriving economy on human misery. Across the North Sea and the Baltic, there were entire cities where the slave trade kept markets alive. Dublin, Hedeby, and Birka were not just ports, they were warehouses of stolen lives. Here, women were paraded like cattle, inspected, and sold to the highest bidder. Most of these slaves, called thralls, were women. Their value wasn't only in the labor they could provide, but in the bodies they could be forced to give. A strong woman could be made to grind grain or haul water. A younger one could be forced into concubinage. Others would be sold to distant lands, where their language, gods, and families would be erased forever. Imagine the humiliation. A woman who just days ago had been a respected wife now standing half-naked before strangers, her fate determined by a pouch of silver coins. Some were bought by chieftains, destined to serve at their feasts. Others were sold to merchants, dragged across seas to Arab markets, where the demand for European slaves was insatiable. The Vikings treated this trade as business. Records and chronicles show that in Dublin alone, thousands of captives passed through its markets. For the Vikings, this was wealth. For the women, it was a living sentence. The battlefield had taken their husbands. The slave markets took everything else. For the Vikings, war wasn't only about territory or revenge. It was about profit. Every raid was an investment, and everything of value was taken: cattle, coins, weapons, gold, and women. In Viking culture, women of defeated enemies were not seen as people anymore. They were considered booty, part of the loot, no different from livestock or silver. A fallen warrior's sword might go to one man. His wife. To another. His daughters. Divided among the raiders or sold for profit. This wasn't done in secret. It was openly accepted as the natural right of the conqueror. A man who fought in the shield wall risked his life not just for honor but for the promise of what waited once victory was secured: wealth, slaves, and women. To the women, this was a living death. Their homes burned behind them, their husbands left lifeless on the battlefield, and suddenly, they themselves were dragged away as spoils of war. For some, it meant immediate violation used as concubines by their captors to celebrate the victory. For others, it meant being chained and marched to the ships, knowing their fate would be decided later in a slave market far from home. These were women who once carried pride as wives of warriors, mothers of children, or daughters of respected men. Overnight, they were stripped of identity and reduced to property. The conqueror's law was simple: if you are not dead, you belong to us. And in the eyes of the Vikings, this wasn't shameful. It was power. Taking an enemy's wife was more than theft, it was domination. A message carved into flesh that said, your warriors could not protect you, your gods could not save you, and now, even your women serve us. For the Vikings, conquering a land didn't end with seizing its gold or burning its halls. The ultimate victory was written on the bodies of its women. Captured wives were not only chained as slaves, many were forced into concubinage. To the Vikings, this was more than lust. It was power, domination, and legacy. Taking an enemy's wife was a way of erasing the warrior she once belonged to, a final insult to the man who had fallen. These women became trophies, reminders that no warrior, no matter how brave, could protect what he loved. A slain man's wife could be dragged into the victor's bed the same night her husband's body was left rotting on the field. To the conquerors, it was not a crime. It was a right. But the cruelty went deeper. Many women were forced into bearing children for their captors. These children, half Viking by blood, were living symbols of conquest. To the Vikings, it was a way of expanding their lineage. To the women, it was a prison inside their own bodies carrying the legacy of men who had slaughtered their kin. Arab chroniclers, like Ibn Fadlan, wrote of Viking women being used as companions and pleasures for their masters, passed from one man to another as gifts. Even in Norse sagas, there are cold mentions of women taken as spoils, woven into the background of victories. Rarely are their names remembered, they were simply possessions, stripped of identity and reduced to flesh. The conquest of the body was psychological as much as physical. To make a wife of a slain warrior serve the man who killed him was the deepest form of humiliation. For the Vikings, it was proof of dominance. For the women, it was torment that lingered far longer than the battle. If death was a blade that struck quickly, this was a wound that never healed. The brutality the Vikings unleashed upon women was not just whispered in fear, it was written down by those who witnessed it. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, one of the earliest records of Viking raids, describes monasteries being plundered, men slaughtered, and women carried away as captives. The words are brief, but behind them lies an ocean of suffering, women torn from their families and forced into lives of bondage. In Ireland, the annals of Ulster tell of Viking raids where entire towns were stripped bare. The men who resisted were cut down. The women were seized in droves and carried off to Norse strongholds like Dublin, which had become one of Europe's largest slave markets. These were not isolated cases, they were patterns repeated across decades of terror. Arab traveler Ibn Fadlan, who encountered the Rus Vikings along the Volga River, left chilling descriptions. He wrote of how Viking men openly used slave women for pleasure, treating them as property to be shared or sold. Women were often forced to serve in public rituals, their dignity erased before the eyes of strangers. Frankish records, too, spoke of Viking raids along the Seine. Churches burned, warriors slain, and women dragged onto ships to vanish into the mist. One monk, writing in despair, compared it to the end of the world. The pagans have taken our women as if they were beasts of the field. Even Norse sagas, written later by the Vikings themselves, contain cold acknowledgments of wife-taking and slave women. They don't dwell on the suffering, they mention it as casually as spoils of gold. To the Viking mind, this cruelty was not a crime but a tradition.